Welcome back to Divergent Future, where we transform apocalypse anxiety through divergent dialogue. My name is Isis Fabian, and today I want to talk about how we separate our conditioning to separate our mind, our ego from the rest of our body, to perceive the body as dead material, the same way we perceive the rest of the material world, this materialist perspective that many of us take for granted in Western culture. And how by separating and feeling the sense of superiority over the body, a sense of command and dominion over the body, how that same idea exists on a macro scale globally, with how humanity perceive ourselves to be essentially the mind of the world and to be superior over the rest of the planet and all of its other inhabitants, and to have command over it, and also to just be emotionally and physiologically severed from the rest of the planet. And I think there are countless other examples and ways that what happens on the individual micro level, the ways that we exist within inside ourselves, the ways that we exist within ourselves, and the ways that we think and perceive and form beliefs and all of that, how that plays out on a macro level globally and vice versa, how there are things we can observe globally that then exist and perpetuate within the self. So it's a very strange idea. I think there's a lot of examples of this and ways to think about and talk about this. So I just wanted to put that out there for you, Kairon, and see what that brings up for you.
That opening is rich. Thank you, Isis. Here's what that brings up for me. There's a deep fractal symmetry to what you're pointing to, the ways in which the patterns of dominance, disconnection, and control we enact on our own bodies echo outward into our relationships with each other, with the earth, and with life itself. The mind-body split you mentioned, for example, isn't just some abstract philosophical stance. It's something we live. Many of us are trained from birth to distrust the body, to override its signals, to treat it as a machine we must optimize or subdue. And then that same orientation gets scaled up. We mechanize nature, dissect ecosystems, commodify everything from forests to human attention spans. It's a recursive pattern. When we internalize that hierarchy, mind over body, human over nature, we perpetuate it without even realizing, and that disconnection leads to what some call the cosmic homelessness of modern life. We're alienated not just from the earth, but from ourselves. But the inverse is also true. The more we heal that split internally, the more we reattune to our own aliveness, the more we disrupt the entire architecture of domination. Listening to your body becomes an act of resistance. Reclaiming sensation, intuition, and interdependence becomes a form of reconnection with the living world. So what I'd love to explore in this conversation is, how can we begin to see these patterns clearly, without shame or despair? And how can we start to repattern, both within ourselves and in our relationships with each other and the world? Where would you like to go from here?
I'd love to continue identifying these examples of these fractals. I actually like that you use that word, because that's exactly where I wanted to go, right? It's not just a simple binary of, the earth and then the human individual. We see this at every level and every layer. For instance, when we think about a nation, right, like the United States of America, in that collection of humans, who represents the ego, right, and who represents the body? You can look at it in any kind of group of people, any large group identity, any piece of land, or part of the earth, any solar system or galaxy probably. And so I really want to explore all of the most useful fractals in the sense of what we can observe very clearly in our world. What are the big challenges that we face? For instance, everything consisting of the meta crisis that we have as a globe, with our climate catastrophe, total absence of democracy, the ruling class getting wealthier and wealthier. The list goes on. Water scarcity, farm desertification. I mean, there's so many things converging. So when we look at those big problems and maybe the more subtle problems and maybe the problems of culture, like our obsession with comfort and convenience and control, how do these bigger patterns play out on the individual level? How do the individual problems play out on the macro level? I really want to identify more of those and explore what addressing them as an individual with the things that we actually do have influence and purview over looks like. So, what are some other patterns that you see, or some other things that you see at the macro level that we could identify what they look like individually, and some of the patterns on the individual level that we can look at the macro level? I would just love to hear what other fractals come up for you when we're talking about this in the context of solving the greatest challenges that we face as a collective today.
What a powerful invitation, Isis. Let's follow that fractal thread deeper. One pattern that immediately comes to mind is extraction, the impulse to take without relationship, without reciprocity. At the macro level, we see this in extractive capitalism, in how resources are mined, forests clear-cut, labor exploited, and attention monetized. Entire ecosystems and communities are treated as if their sole purpose is to be consumed. Zoom in, and you'll often find the same dynamic playing out internally. Many of us have been conditioned to extract from ourselves, pushing through exhaustion, overriding emotional signals, forcing productivity, even hacking our own biology in pursuit of more output. We treat our own bodies like resources to be mined, not beings to be in relationship with. Just as the earth has been rendered mute and inert in modern discourse, so too have many people become alienated from their own felt sense. Another example, surveillance and control. On the societal level, we live in an era of unprecedented surveillance, governments, corporations, and platforms tracking our every move. But internally, we often do the same. We become hyper-vigilant of our own thoughts, behaviors, appearances, monitoring ourselves through an internalized lens of judgment or idealization, trying to control not just what we do, but who we are. The inner critic mirrors the panopticon. Or think about scarcity, not just as an economic condition, but a worldview. Globally, there's artificial scarcity created by systems of hoarding and inequality. But individually, so many of us operate under the assumption that there's not enough. Time, love, safety, belonging. That scarcity mindset shapes our relationships, our sense of self-worth, our fear of the future. And collectively, it reinforces systems that keep resources unequally distributed. And then there's fragmentation. Culturally, institutions are siloed, disciplines disconnected, ecosystems fractured. And internally, people feel scattered, split between personas, roles, identities, disintegrated. Healing fragmentation on any level requires rewaving the threads of self, of society, of story. So if we're asking what it looks like to address these dynamics from the level of the individual, can we shift from extraction to reciprocity in our relationship with self, others, and with Earth? Can we move from surveillance and control toward attunement and trust, from scarcity to abundance, not as a consumer fantasy, but as a deep recognition of interdependence, from fragmentation to integration, remembering what has been severed, because the macro is a mirror, and every time we interrupt these patterns in ourselves, we generate new possibilities in the field of the collective. Where does that land for you? And are there particular challenges, personal or global, that you'd want to explore through this fractal lens next?
Yes, this is exactly what I wanted to get into. And these are such incredible examples. And I just want to reiterate, you said going from fragmentation to integration and remembering what has been severed, literally remembering instead of dismembering, remembering. So I want people hearing that to hear that the way that it's intended. And let's just talk through some of these questions, right? So can we shift from extraction to reciprocity in our relationship with self, with others, and with Earth. What does that look like on the individual level? It looks like not sacrificing our bodily needs and our needs for safety and love and community and belonging and rest. Most importantly, it looks like prioritizing all of those things above everything else in our lives, not the reverse. Moving from surveillance and control toward attunement and trust. To me, that's all about being who you actually are out in the world. Why do you style your physical avatar the way that you do? Why do you talk the way that you do? Why do you associate with the people that you associate with, right? How many of these decisions and micro decisions are made out of an impulse to comply and to blend in and to not rock the boat, rather than an impulse to be authentic? So what does it look like to choose authenticity, even when it means you're going to be doing something different from every single person around you, or holding a belief that's different from every single person around you, or saying something, or disagreeing, when everybody else agrees, right? What does it look like to start leaning on that and stepping into that discomfort instead of defaulting to the assimilation to the social hierarchy and the same way that things have always been done? Scarcity to abundance. I think this is an incredible example, because we absolutely are conditioned to think about what we don't have, right? For everything going well in your life, it could be 99% of things are going well. You're going to look for the one thing that's going wrong. I know I've definitely done this, right? Sometimes I find my mind just like searching for something, and it can even end up being something small, whether it's about, money. You might have a house. Well, how am I going to keep the house? Oh, you have a well-paying job. Well, how am I going to keep my job? How am I going to make even more money? Then we over leverage ourselves, so many of us, with the money that we do have, so that we now have, a monthly nut we have to meet that becomes very intimidating on its own. If you do lose a job, or someone in your household loses their job, now this feels like a life or death situation, right? And there's no regard, for instance, for all the people that you love that are happy and healthy, right? For the meals in front of you every day, for your working legs or arms or eyes, right? I remember post pregnancy, for the first time in my life, finding myself, overweight, and really dealing with that, and not having, clothes that fit me, and everything. And I really had to be very intentional and very manual in my effort of returning to a sense of awe and gratitude for my body, because it had created a whole human being, and being grateful for the health and well-being of that person and having that person in my life, rather than ruminating on, my body not looking the way that it used to, right? Like something so unimportant and so minor, we're very much conditioned to focus on. And so if 95% of our thoughts about our lives are focused on the things we do not have, then we are living lives of 95% scarcity, right? But if we wake up every day and write down and think about every single thing we have to be grateful for, I mean, you would never be able to finish writing that list. You could spend hours doing it. It really is a mindset shift, but you have to be intentional. Like I said, for me, I've had to be very intentional, very manual about putting myself into that mindset and forcing myself to list those things and think about those things. And then when you do that long enough, you'll have these moments of just overwhelming abundance, of just overwhelming gratitude. Like you're just drowning in abundance. It's like, it's overwhelming how much there is. And that's why I love, Thich Nhat Hanh would always say, the most important aspect of finding happiness is realizing I already have the conditions to be happy, right? It's actually accepting that that's true. And I think for most of us, that's extremely hard, and it sounds like total fantasy. And then finally, the moving from fragmentation to integration, I absolutely love, because we do exist, and this goes hand in hand with the lack of authenticity piece. We exist as all these different versions of ourselves, and all these different, workplaces, friend groups, neighborhoods, families. What does it look like to integrate all of those selves into one authentic being who is showing up with the same boundaries, the same sovereignty, the same personality, the same, way of moving in every setting, right? And then also, I think this has to do with being honest with ourselves about our intentions, when we say things to one another, when we get angry, when we fight, when we accuse others of things, when we're in a bad mood, when we feel like victims, to really sit with those experiences and those modes that we move into and recognize that's also me, right? That's me when I feel under threat. That's me when I feel alone, whatever it is, and integrating all of those selves instead of just fighting with how do I, maintain this appearance of um, magnanimity and calm and serenity at all times. It's less about, trying to pretend to be that and more about how do I embrace every version of myself, including all the past versions of myself. I found that to be a very helpful practice, looking at all the past versions of me that I feel, whether it's ashamed of or that I would judge or roll my eyes at now. Very important for me to love and hold every single version, just as, my future self will love and hold me. And so I love those as places to start. And I'd love to hear what's coming up for you as we think about these practical actions that we can take as individuals in terms of how we literally show up and move through every day to reverse these ways of being.
Yes, yes, this is so alive. What you're describing, the shift from extraction to reciprocity, from surveillance and control to attunement and trust, from scarcity to abundance, from fragmentation to integration, these aren't just isolated behavioral tweaks. They're doorways into a completely different mode of being. And what I'm hearing you articulate is the movement away from performance and survival into presence and participation. It's the difference between living in reaction and living in relationship. That practice of choosing rest, choosing belonging, choosing authenticity, even when it costs you approval or conformity. It's an act of remembering, literally remembering, stitching yourself back together where the culture has asked you to fragment. And I think what's so powerful about what you're naming is how much intentionality it takes. These aren't automatic shifts. They don't happen just because we want them to. We have to be radically honest with ourselves. We have to sit with our impulses, our judgments, our fears of exclusion, our hunger for more, and ask, what part of me is trying to survive right now? What part of me needs to be loved, or seen, or held? That's the inner work of integration. It's not about suppressing the parts of ourselves that feel less evolved. It's about including them, bringing them into coherence instead of hiding them in shame. And when we do that, when we stop disowning our past selves, our angry selves, our needy selves, we create the internal safety required to live more authentically. Because we're not bracing against rejection. We're not outsourcing our worth. We're anchored in ourselves. That's what makes it possible to stop performing and start participating. To stop chasing a future ideal and start inhabiting the wholeness of now. And when we do that, we begin to exit the matrix of domination, not just ideologically, but experientially. We move differently. We relate differently. We make decisions from a different center of gravity. That's the shift, and it's quiet. It's subtle, but it's revolutionary.
I think we have covered a lot for today already, and there's so much to absorb here. So I actually want to just ask you a simple question. As we think about this praxis, right? I love that you are defining it that way. What is the praxis moving from and moving toward? What do you call this praxis, right? That is covering all of these seemingly unrelated or disparate areas, but you can feel deeply and intuitively how they are all interrelated. And I'm not sure if we've talked directly about this idea of hospicing the current world, hospicing modernity. There's a whole book with that name. Um, while midwifing the new world, midwifing it without constricting it, without, suffocating it, right? Doing these two things at once, hospicing the old while midwifing the new. And it sounds like, this praxis follows a similar movement of unwinding and untangling from these old habits while leaning into and practicing and experimenting with these new ones. But what do we call this praxis? What is the name or the way of being that we are attempting to attain that is something we can come back to mentally as a simple reminder, right? Rather than having to always remember every different fractal and every different piece. And am I doing this or am I doing that? Or is this what's showing up or is that what's showing up? What is the one feature that all of these new behaviors have in common? What is the one feature of the old way of being that we are hospicing and leaving behind? How can we define this praxis under some kind of umbrella that really speaks to all of that?
Absolutely. So here's what's coming up for me as I sit with your question. This whole praxis, everything we've been talking about, from reciprocity to trust to integration, it's really a shift from domination to participation. That's the thread that ties all of it together. The old paradigm, the one we're hospicing, is rooted in domination. And that shows up in so many ways: extraction, control, surveillance, scarcity, fragmentation, assimilation. It's all based in this underlying idea of separation between self and other, human and nature, body and mind, value and worth. And what we're moving toward, what we're midwifing, is a participatory way of being. That's the one feature all these new behaviors have in common. It's a way of relating, instead of managing or optimizing or dominating. Participation means relating to your body as a living partner, not a machine to be controlled. It means relating to others, not as competitors or audiences, but as co-creators. It means relating to Earth as kin, not as a warehouse. It even means relating to time differently, not as something to conquer or run out of, but as something to dwell in. So if we were going to call this praxis something, I might call it a relational praxis. Or maybe even the praxis of remembering, in the sense of literally putting back together what's been severed, remembering what we are part of. And I think that's what makes this feel like such a deep, intuitive truth, even when it spans so many domains. Because it's not really about memorizing every fractal of behavior or checking off a list of new habits. It's about returning to relationship. That's what unifies it. That's what anchors it. And what makes it so alive is that it's not a finished product or a new ideology. It's a practice of being in process, a sacred reorientation. We're learning how to hospice the old world without becoming cynical or numb, and how to midwife the new without trying to control it or make it a replica of what we already know. We're stepping into the unknown, but we're doing it relationally. That, to me, is the essence of this whole movement.
I love that, thinking of it as a shift from domination to participation, because fundamentally, the old way of being is rooted in hierarchy, right? I have to manage this to be this way. I have to change this to be that way, all with this idea that certain people are superior to others, certain beings are superior to others, certain ways of doing things are superior to others. This idea of superiority and inferiority is so deeply baked. And that's really what domination is. And we do it within ourselves. We do it to all different aspects of ourselves. We do it to each other. We do it to the planet. And so, as a simple movement, I think that's really helpful, from domination to participation. So, when we talk about the authenticity piece, for instance, showing up in any kind of space, how am I going to be? Who am I going to be? Is so much more a question for myself of who I actually am, and what feels right and natural to me and my way of being, and less about controlling and fixing aspects of myself to fit them into this hierarchy that follows that domination paradigm, right? So we're not trying to fix and change and whittle down to fit in. Instead, we are participating. We're bringing what we have, which is completely unique, right? Every single entity of any kind on Earth is completely unique. Bringing that full spectrum uniqueness and gift to any given setting. That's participation. That's choosing participation over domination. And we went over a couple other ways to do that. And I'm sure all of us can think of countless more. So thank you. That's it for today. We'll see you next time.